Laura Christie had spent 18 years learning the particular geometry of a perfect life. Magnolia Ridge taught its daughters early the right fork, the right church pew, the right kind of quiet when a room needed you seen and not heard. Laura mastered all of it before she turned 16, gliding through cotillions and country club luncheons in dresses her mother chose from catalogs that never listed a price. Vivian Christie built that life with her own hands, or so she always said. A senior partner at one of Jackson's most prestigious firms, she wore her success like a second skin. Tailored blazers, a corner office with a view of the Capitol, a black card that never seemed to reach its limit. Laura grew up believing her mother's success was simply the natural order of things, the way some families had gardens and others had oil money. She met Victor Ashworth the summer before her senior year at a fundraiser her mother had dragged her to, one of those events where the champagne flowed easier than the conversation. He found her by the dessert table, tall and easy smiling, the kind of handsome that came from 3 generations of old money and good bone structure. His family owned half the timber rights in 3 counties. Everyone in Magnolia Ridge knew the Ashworth name the way they knew the weather, a fact of life, unquestioned. "You're the only interesting person here," he told her, and Laura, 17 and starving for anything that felt like being chosen, believed him completely. What followed was 18 months of stolen weekends and late-night drives with the windows down, of Victor's hand finding hers under restaurant tables where his family's friends might see, of a relationship that was never quite official because Victor's mother had opinions about who her son should be seen with in public, opinions Laura noticed but chose for a long time not to examine too closely. She told herself it didn't matter. He looked at her like she was the only girl who'd ever mattered, and when he touched her, slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world to learn every inch of her, she forgot to ask the questions that would have unraveled everything sooner. The night everything cracked open started like any other. Victor's parents were away, and he'd texted her the address of the lake house with 3 words: "Come alone, wear nothing under your dress." She'd laughed reading it, heat pooling low in her belly before she'd even climbed into her car. He was waiting on the dock when she arrived, barefoot, sleeves rolled, the last of the summer light catching gold in his hair. "You came," he said, like he hadn't been sure she would, like the 2 of them were already tangled together in something neither had the courage to name. "You knew I would." She let him pull her close, let his hands settle at her waist, the particular hush of the lake at dusk, wrapping around them both. Inside, the house was dim and cool, and Victor undressed her slowly on the stairs, like unwrapping something he'd waited all year to open, his mouth finding her throat, her collarbone, murmuring her name like a secret he'd been keeping just for tonight. She arched into him, breath catching, fingers tangled in his shirt, the whole world narrowing down to the warmth of his skin and the low, hungry sound he made against her ear. Later, tangled in the sheets, with the lake breeze drifting through an open window, Laura let herself believe, just for a moment, that this was the beginning of something real, instead of the beginning of the end. The end came 3 weeks later, at a party Laura almost didn't attend. It was Victor's cousin's engagement celebration, held at the Ashworth family estate, all white tents and string lights strung between 100-year-old oaks. Laura had spent 2 hours getting ready, choosing a dress she hoped would finally make her feel like she belonged in rooms like this one instead of merely tolerated in them. She found Victor by the bar, 3 bourbons in and loose in a way she hadn't seen before, laughing with a group of his cousins she vaguely recognized from old family photos. He waved her over, pulled her against his side with the easy possessiveness of a man who'd had too much to drink and not enough sense to know it mattered. "This is Laura," he said to the group, and something in his tone made her stomach tighten before she understood why. One of the cousins, a broad-shouldered man with his father's jaw and his mother's cruelty, looked her over slowly, the way people look at things they don't expect to last. "Laura," he repeated, testing the name. "She's a pretty thing, Vic. You keeping her around for a while, or is this one of your usuals?" "Careful," Victor said, but he was laughing when he said it. Laughing. The cousin smirked, leaned in like he was sharing something clever. "I'm just saying, man, you know how your mama feels about you bringing home a—" He said the word. Casual. Ugly. The kind of word that had lived in this state long before Laura was born and would outlive every polite conversation meant to pretend it didn't exist anymore. He said it like it cost him nothing, like it wasn't a blade, and the group around him laughed, actually laughed, like he'd told a joke instead of gutted her standing there in her careful dress in the middle of a party full of people who all apparently already knew exactly what she was to them. Laura went very still, the kind of stillness that comes right before the floor drops out from under you. She looked at Victor, waited for him to say something, anything, to close the 3-week gap that had just cracked open into a canyon between the man she thought she knew and the one currently letting his cousin's laughter die down without a single word of correction. "I need to go," she said. Victor reached for her arm. "Laura, come on, don't be like this." She pulled away before his hand could land. "Don't call me," she said, and for the first time all summer, her voice didn't shake. If you're settling in for tonight's story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy stories like this one. It helps more than you know. Laura drove home that night with the windows down and the radio off, replaying the sound of that laughter until her hands stopped shaking on the wheel. She told herself it was over. She told herself she'd cry about it tomorrow, once she'd had time to grieve the version of Victor she'd built in her head, instead of the one who actually existed. She never got the chance. 3 days later, she came home from her shift at the boutique to find 2 black SUVs parked crooked in the driveway, and her mother's assistant standing on the porch, ashen-faced, refusing to meet her eyes. Inside, men in gray suits moved through the house with the calm efficiency of people who did this for a living, tagging furniture, boxing files, speaking to each other in low voices Laura wasn't meant to understand. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, still in yesterday's clothes, staring at nothing. "Mama?" Laura's voice came out smaller than she intended. Vivian Christie looked up, and for the first time in Laura's entire life, her mother looked afraid. "Sit down, baby. I need you to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything at all." What followed took 11 minutes. 11 minutes to unravel 18 years of designer dresses and private school tuition and a black card that never seemed to reach its limit. Her mother's firm had been under federal investigation for 6 months. Client funds moved through accounts that shouldn't have existed. Numbers quietly adjusted in ledgers no one was supposed to read closely. Vivian hadn't built her success with her own 2 hands. She'd built it on other people's money, borrowed against a future that had finally, catastrophically come due. Everything's frozen, her mother said. The house, the cars, my accounts, everything, Laura. There's a hearing in 2 weeks, and I don't know yet what happens after that. Laura sat very still, the same stillness from 3 nights ago at the Ashworth estate, except this time there was no laughing cousin to blame, no ugly word to point to as the source of the wound. This time, the wound was her whole life, and the person who'd carved it out from underneath her was sitting 6 feet away, waiting for Laura to say something that would make either of them feel less alone in the wreckage. "What am I supposed to do?" Laura asked finally. Her mother's hands, always so steady in courtrooms and boardrooms, trembled around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from. "There's your father, Marcus. He's still in North Carolina. I already called him." Laura hadn't seen her father in 6 years. She barely remembered the sound of his voice. Marcus Bell had left Mississippi when Laura was 12 after a custody arrangement that gave Vivian everything and him a handful of summer weeks that dwindled year by year into phone calls that came less and less often. Laura remembered him mostly in fragments, the smell of his cologne, the way he used to hum while he drove, a laugh that came from somewhere low in his chest. She didn't remember him as a stranger, but 6 years of silence had made him one anyway. The 2 weeks between the raid and the drive to North Carolina blurred together in a haze of packing boxes and lawyers' phone calls Laura wasn't allowed to fully understand. Her mother's hearing had been moved up. There was talk of a plea deal, of restitution, of a sentence that might or might not involve actual prison time depending on how the negotiations went. Laura sat through none of it directly. She was, the lawyers reminded her gently, a minor bystander to her mother's collapse, not a participant in it, though the distinction felt meaningless when everything she'd ever known was being cataloged and seized around her. She packed what she could into 2 suitcases. Most of her closet stayed behind, property now of creditors instead of memory. She kept only what actually mattered, a handful of photographs, her grandmother's cross necklace, the acceptance letter to Ashcroft State University that had arrived 4 months earlier, back when her biggest worry was choosing a dorm room mate instead of choosing a whole new life. Her mother drove her to the bus station because Vivian's license had been suspended pending the outcome of the hearing, one more small humiliation added to the pile. They stood on the platform in silence, 2 women who'd spent 18 years perfecting the art of not talking about hard things, now facing the hardest thing either of them had ever had to say out loud. "I'm sorry," Vivian said finally. "I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't give you back the life I promised you, but I am sorry, Laura, more than you'll probably ever believe." Laura studied her mother's face, the same face she'd trusted completely for 18 years, the same face that had, apparently, been quietly building a house of cards the entire time. "I believe you're sorry," she said slowly. "I just don't know yet if that's enough." The bus ride took 11 hours. Laura spent most of it staring out the window, watching Mississippi give way to Alabama, then Georgia, then finally the rolling hills of North Carolina, a landscape she didn't recognize, belonging to a father she barely remembered. She thought about Victor exactly twice during the entire ride, once somewhere around the Alabama state line, and once when the bus stopped for gas and she caught her own reflection in the window, still faintly bruised around the eyes from 3 sleepless nights. She didn't cry either time. She'd used up most of her tears already, back in that kitchen watching men in gray suits carry away the only life she'd ever known. By the time the bus pulled into the small station outside Ashcroft, the sun had already started sinking behind unfamiliar hills. Laura stepped off with 2 suitcases and no clear idea what her father even looked like anymore, scanning the handful of waiting faces until she found a man standing slightly apart from the rest. Tall, broad-shouldered, gray threading through hair she remembered as fully black, wearing an expression somewhere between hope and terror. "Laura?" he said, like he wasn't quite sure, like 6 years might have changed her enough that he needed permission to recognize his own daughter. "Dad," she said, and the word felt strange and unfamiliar in her mouth, a language she hadn't spoken in years. Marcus Bale's house sat on a quiet street in a neighborhood called Willow Bend, a working-class stretch of Ashcroft where the houses were smaller and closer together than anything Laura had grown up around, where the cars and the driveways were older and better cared for, where kids rode bikes up and down the block until the streetlights came on. It was, in almost every visible way, the opposite of Magnolia Ridge. If tonight's story is keeping you company, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's good to know who's here with us. Renee, her father's wife, met them at the door with a caution that Laura understood immediately, the careful politeness of a woman meeting the daughter from a marriage that ended before she arrived. She was warm enough, offering a guest room already made up with fresh sheets, a home-cooked meal Laura barely had appetite for, but there was a distance in it too, an unspoken agreement that Laura's arrival was a complication neither of them had chosen. "Your room's upstairs, second door," Renee said. "Deshawn's room is across the hall if you need anything and your dad's asleep." Deshawn, Laura's half-brother, 16 years old, a stranger who shared half her blood and none of her history. She'd met him exactly twice in her life, both times as a small child too young to remember clearly. He appeared in the kitchen doorway that first night, tall for his age, wary, studying her with the particular suspicion teenagers reserve for anyone who might upend the careful order of their household. "You're the sister from Mississippi," he said, not quite a question. "Laura," she said, "you're Deshawn." He nodded once, offered nothing further, and disappeared back upstairs before dinner was even finished. Laura understood without needing it explained that she'd have to earn whatever relationship existed between them. Nothing here would be given freely, the way things had always been given to her back home. Home. She caught herself using the word and immediately doubted whether it applied to anything anymore. That first night, lying in an unfamiliar bed under a ceiling she didn't recognize, Laura let herself cry for the first time since the raid. Not for Victor, whose absence barely registered anymore against everything else that had collapsed. For her mother, awaiting sentencing 3 states away. For the life she'd assumed was permanent, the one that turned out to be built on nothing sturdier than other people's stolen money. For herself, mostly, for the girl who'd spent 18 years learning exactly how to move through a world that no longer had any use for the version of her it had built. She didn't sleep much that first night. Somewhere down the hall she could hear her father's voice, low, talking to Renee about logistics, enrollment paperwork, a bus schedule to campus, whether Laura would need a car eventually, or whether the transit line would do for now. Practical things, the kind of conversation that meant whatever else was true, he intended to actually keep her. Orientation week at Ashcroft State arrived faster than Laura felt ready for. She'd deferred her original plans of an out-of-state private university the moment her mother's assets froze, scrambling instead to transfer her acceptance to the in-state school close enough to her father's address to make commuting possible. It was, by any objective measure, still a good school. It simply wasn't the life she'd spent 4 years imagining for herself. She walked the quad that first morning in an outfit she'd carefully chosen to look effortless, a habit so deeply ingrained she hadn't even considered doing otherwise. It took exactly 1 class period to realize how badly she'd misjudged the room. Her designer bag drew glances she couldn't quite decode, not admiration, not quite judgment, something more complicated, an assessment she didn't yet have the vocabulary to understand. "You lost?" a girl in her intro to sociology class asked, not unkindly, eyeing Laura's outfit with open curiosity. "You look like you wandered off a magazine shoot." Laura laughed, though it came out thinner than she intended. "Just new, trying to figure out where everything is." The girl, who introduced herself as Priya, took mercy on her, walking her between buildings and explaining the unofficial map of campus life that no orientation packet ever covered, which dining hall had the better food, which professors graded fairly, which parts of campus felt safe walking alone after dark. Laura absorbed all of it gratefully, aware for the first time in her life of how much invisible knowledge she'd taken for granted back home, where everyone already knew everything about everyone before they arrived. By the end of the first week, she'd learned other things, too. That her accent, softened by years of private school elocution, but still unmistakably Mississippi, made people ask where she was from in a tone that suggested the question wasn't entirely friendly. That mentioning her mother's old firm out of habit drew a silence in one seminar room sharp enough to make her stomach drop. Apparently the story had made regional news, the kind of scandal that traveled. That the careful, curated version of herself she'd spent 18 years perfecting simply didn't translate here, in a world where nobody cared which fork you used or which cotillion you'd attended, where the only currency that mattered was whether you showed up and did the work. She called her mother twice that first week, brief, careful calls, monitored by a facility phone system that cut conversations off after 15 minutes. Vivian's sentencing had landed on 18 months, reduced from what the prosecutors originally sought, a fact her mother relayed with the flat exhaustion of someone who'd stopped expecting good news of any kind. "How's your father treating you?" Vivian asked during the second call, her voice thin through the prison line. "Fine. Different. It's a lot to get used to." "You'll get used to it," her mother said. "You're stronger than you know, baby. I should have told you that more before everything." Laura hung up, wondering whether her mother believed that, or whether it was simply the only comfort left available to offer from 3 states and a locked door away. She met Judd on a Thursday evening in late September at a cookout her father insisted she attend, held in the backyard of a house 2 streets over belonging to a family Marcus had known for over a decade. Deshawn had grudgingly agreed to bring her along, more at Renee's insistence than his own, and Laura found herself standing at the edge of a crowded backyard holding a paper plate of food she barely recognized, feeling, once again, entirely out of place. "You're not eating," a voice said beside her, low and unbothered, carrying none of the careful distance most people at Ashcroft had greeted her so far. She turned to find a young man watching her with an expression somewhere between amused and curious, tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who worked with his hands rather than a gym membership, dark eyes that seemed to catalog far more than they let on. He wore a plain white t-shirt and jeans with the easy confidence of someone who'd never once worried about whether he belonged in a room. "I don't really know what half of this is," Laura admitted, gesturing at her plate. "That's oxtail," he said, pointing, and that's collards. And if you don't eat the mac and cheese before Miss Pauline notices, she'll take it personal. He extended a hand. Judd, Deshawn's best friend since we were about 8 years old. Laura, she shook his hand, aware of the calluses across his palm, evidence of actual labor rather than idle privilege. Deshawn's sister, half-sister technically. I know who you are. Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. Whole town knows who you are, honestly. Mississippi girl, big house, big scandal, word travels. The bluntness of it stung more than she expected, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't trying to wound her, simply refusing to pretend around a truth everyone else tiptoed past. That's not really who I am, she said, hearing the defensiveness in her own voice. That's just what happened to me. Fair. He studied her a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. Most people don't know the difference at first. Took me about 30 seconds to figure you weren't as soft as the bag you walked in carrying. Excuse me? The designer bag, he said, nodding toward the expensive leather draped over her shoulder, clearly still a habit she hadn't yet learned to unlearn. Laura felt heat rise in her cheeks, equal parts embarrassment and something else she didn't immediately recognize as attraction, because attraction seemed like an absurd response to a man who just openly insulted her handbag within the first 2 minutes of meeting her. You're awfully sure of yourself for someone I just met. I've been called worse. A small, unhurried smile. Come on, before Miss Pauline gives your mac and cheese to somebody who'll actually eat it. Over the following weeks, Judd became a fixture Laura hadn't planned for, showing up at Deshawn's house often enough that his presence started to feel less like coincidence and more like something neither of them had bothered naming yet. He worked most afternoons at his uncle's auto shop across town, saving toward a business degree he was chipping away at one night class at a time, a fact Laura only learned because Deshawn mentioned it offhandedly, not because Judd himself had felt any need to explain his own worth to her. He's not showing off for you, Deshawn told her one evening with the blunt honesty of a 16-year-old who hadn't yet learned social diplomacy. Judd doesn't show off for anybody. If he's around, it's because he wants to be. Laura filed that observation away carefully, unsure what to do with the flicker of warmth it produced. Their conversations, when they happened, rarely stayed comfortable for long. Judd had an unnerving habit of asking questions that cut straight past whatever performance Laura still occasionally reached for out of old habit. Why do you keep apologizing for things that aren't your fault? He asked her one Saturday afternoon, watching her help Winnie unload groceries with a kind of anxious efficiency Laura hadn't consciously noticed in herself. I don't know, Laura admitted, startled by the accuracy of the observation. Maybe it's just habit. Whose habit? Yours or the one your mama's money taught you? The question landed sharper than he probably intended, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't trying to be cruel, just honest in a way Laura had rarely encountered from anyone in her old life. That's not fair, she said, though she wasn't entirely sure it wasn't. Maybe not, Judd allowed, but it's true. You walk around here waiting for permission to take up space, like you're still worried somebody's gonna tell you you don't belong. Nobody here cares about your mama's money, Laura. Nobody ever did. That's not what makes people respect you round here. Then what does? He considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything. Showing up, he said finally. Doing what you say you're gonna do, not pretending to be something you're not just because it's easier than figuring out who you actually are underneath all that performance. Laura didn't have an answer for that. She stood in her father's driveway, arms full of grocery bags, feeling more exposed by a boy she'd known barely a month than she had in 18 years of carefully curated conversation back home. She didn't sleep well that night either, but it was a different kind of restlessness than before. Less grief, more something unfamiliar stirring awake underneath it, something that felt dangerously close to hope. She lay awake replaying his words instead of her mother's absence, and found, to her own surprise, that she didn't mind the trade. October settled over Willow Bend with a chill Laura wasn't quite used to, having spent 18 Mississippi autumns that rarely dipped below sweater weather. She'd started, without entirely meaning to, building her days around small pockets of time that overlapped with Judd's schedule. A shared study table at the campus library on the evenings he took his night class, a habit of walking the 2 blocks to his uncle's shop after her afternoon classes ended, telling herself each time it was simply convenient, not deliberate. If this story is helping you unwind tonight, take a moment to hit the like button. It helps more people find their way to these stories when they need them. The shop itself fascinated her in ways she hadn't expected. She'd grown up in a world where cars were simply objects that appeared, maintained by people whose names she never learned. Watching Judd work, sleeves pushed up, hands sure and quick across an engine, explaining terminology she'd never once needed to know, revealed a competence that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with earned skill. "You actually like this," she observed one afternoon, perched on an overturned crate while he replaced a belt on someone's aging sedan. "Love it, actually." He didn't look up from his work. "There's something satisfying about fixing something broken with your own 2 hands. Most things in life, you can't just diagnose the problem and patch it. Cars, you can. Feels good, having at least one part of your life make that kind of sense." "Is that a metaphor?" He glanced up then, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Maybe. You tell me. You're the one who studies people for a living, or at least that's what your sociology class is supposed to teach you." Laura laughed, surprised by how easily it came these days, compared to the careful, performed laughter she used to offer people back home. "I'm supposed to be studying people, yes. Instead, I'm apparently studying car engines. Could be worse things to study." He wiped his hands on a rag, finally giving her his full attention. "How's the rest of it going? School, your dad's house, all of it?" "Better than I expected," I admitted. "Still strange some days. I keep waiting to feel like I actually belong here instead of just visiting." "You don't have to earn belonging, Laura." His voice carried none of its usual teasing edge. "Not the way you think you do. You're already here. That's most of what matters." She studied him for a long moment, struck by how easily he said things that dismantled, piece by piece, every assumption she'd carried into this new life. "You say things like that a lot, things that sound simple but aren't really." "Comes from growing up with not much," he said simply. "You learn early what actually matters and what's just noise. Money's noise, mostly. Took me a while to realize some people never learn that because they've never had to." The comment could have landed as an accusation. Instead, it settled somewhere gentler, an observation offered without judgment, and Laura found herself, for the first time since arriving in North Carolina, genuinely grateful for the clarity of it. The tension between them thickened gradually, the way humidity gathers before a storm neither party has quite decided to acknowledge. Judd started showing up at her father's house on evenings he had no obvious reason to visit, claiming errands for Deshawn that never quite added up. Laura, for her part, found excuses to linger at the shop long after her homework was finished, telling herself she simply enjoyed the quiet of watching him work. Deshawn noticed before either of them said anything out loud. "You know he likes you, right?" he said one evening, with the blunt confidence of a younger sibling who'd finally found something interesting enough to comment on. "Judd, he's not usually around this much. He's here for you now, not me." "We're just friends," Laura said, though the denial came out weaker than she intended. Deshawn gave her a look that suggested he found her answer deeply unconvincing. Sure, friends who stare at each other across the dinner table like they're trying to solve a math problem. He shrugged. "Just saying, Mama's side of the family back in Mississippi would probably have a whole lot to say about it if they knew." The comment landed with more weight than Deshawn probably intended. Laura had, in fact, been carefully avoiding any mention of Judd during her brief, monitored calls with relatives back home. An aunt who'd called twice to check on her, a grandmother who sent a card with money folded inside it. She knew, without needing to ask directly, exactly what her mother's side of the family would say about a man like Judd. She'd grown up hearing the coded language for years, disguised as concern. "Marry up, baby, not down. Find someone who can take care of you the way you're used to. Someone respectable, someone with the right kind of last name, the right kind of college, the right kind of future already mapped out in advance." Judd, with his auto shop job and his community college night classes and his unapologetic bluntness, represented everything that careful coded language had warned her against her entire life. She thought about that warning later that evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table while he helped her work through a statistics problem set neither of them particularly enjoyed, watching the careful concentration on his face as he worked through the math slower than her, but with more patience than she usually gave herself credit for having. "You're staring," he said without looking up. "Sorry." She wasn't particularly, just thinking. "About what?" She hesitated, unsure how honest to be. "About how different my life would look right now if none of this had happened, if my mother's firm had never collapsed, if I'd never had to leave Mississippi." Judd set down his pencil, giving her the same full, unhurried attention he'd given the statistics problem moments earlier. "Would you want that, the old life back?" Laura considered the question seriously, surprised by how long it took her to find an honest answer. "No," she said finally, "I don't think I would, which feels strange to admit considering how much I lost." "Sometimes losing the wrong thing is how you find the right one," he said quietly. "Doesn't make the losing hurt less, but it's not nothing either." She wanted, badly, to ask exactly what he meant by the right one. She didn't ask. Some questions, she was learning, mattered more left unspoken a little while longer. The moment that finally broke the careful distance between them arrived on a rainy Friday night in late October, when Judd showed up at her father's door, soaked through, having walked the mile from the shop after his car wouldn't start. "Why didn't you call somebody?" Laura asked, pulling him inside, grabbing a towel from the hall closet before either of them had really processed how close they were suddenly standing. "Didn't want to bother anybody this late." He took the towel, though he made no move to actually dry off, watching her instead with an intensity that made her pulse pick up, despite the mundane practicality of the moment. "You're the only person whose number I actually thought to call." "That's not an answer." "Maybe it is. Maybe I just wanted an excuse to see you tonight, and a dead battery seemed as good as any." The house was empty, her father and Reme out at a neighbor's dinner party. Deshawn spending the night at a friend's house, leaving them alone in a kitchen lit only by the stove light, rain drumming steady against the windows. Laura became suddenly acutely aware of how close he was standing, of the damp fabric of his shirt clinging to his shoulders, of the particular way he was looking at her, like he'd been waiting a long time for permission he wasn't sure he'd ever get. Judd. His name came out barely above a whisper. I know. He didn't move closer, didn't need to. The air between them had already closed most of the distance on its own. I know exactly what you're going to say, that I'm not what your family wants for you, that I don't fit whatever picture you were raised to imagine for your life. That's not, she stopped, forced herself towards honesty instead of the easier deflection. That's not what I was going to say. I was going to say I don't care anymore what anyone imagined for me. I spent 18 years building a life around other people's expectations, and look how that turned out. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief, or both at once. So what do you want? Not what you're supposed to want, what you actually want, Laura. She closed the last of the distance herself, answering the question with her hands, finding the damped fabric of his shirt instead of words. He made a low sound against her mouth when their lips finally met, one hand sliding careful and certain along her jaw, like he was memorizing the shape of her by touch alone. The other pressed flat against the small of her back, drawing her in until there was no space left between them at all. They stayed like that a long moment, rain still drumming steady outside, the kitchen's quiet stove light the only witness to something neither of them had planned, but both, apparently, had been waiting for far longer than either wanted to admit. When they finally pulled apart, Judd rested his forehead against hers, breathing unsteady, both of them clearly aware that whatever had just happened couldn't be quietly folded back into the careful friendship they'd been pretending to maintain. That complicates things, he said, though the small smile tugging at his mouth suggested he wasn't particularly bothered by the complication. It does, Laura agreed. I don't regret it, though. Good, 'cause neither do I. He pulled back slightly, studying her face with the same careful attention he brought to everything. But I need you to actually think about this, Laura. Not just tonight, in the middle of a storm, with your daddy's house empty and the rain making everything feel more romantic than it probably is. I need you to think about what it actually means dating somebody like me, somebody your mama's whole side of the family already decided before they even met me wasn't good enough for you. I don't know what they decided. I know the type, he said, not unkindly. I've spent my whole life around people who look at where I come from and draw their own conclusions before I even open my mouth. I don't need your family to say it directly to know exactly what they'd think. Laura wanted to argue, but the words caught somewhere in her throat because she couldn't honestly promise he was wrong. She thought of her grandmother's careful, coded warnings. She thought of aunts who'd ask eventually about the boy Deshawn's friend and what she planned to do with him once the novelty wore off. I don't know what they'd think, but I know what I think, and right now, that feels like it should matter more. It should. Doesn't mean it always will once things get complicated. Family's got a way of making you doubt things you were sure of 5 minutes earlier. Is that what happened to you? Somebody in your family made you doubt something you were sure about? Something flickered across his face, guarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Something like that, he said, not elaborating further, and Laura understood, without needing to press, that there were parts of his own history he wasn't ready to hand over yet, not tonight, maybe not for a while. Okay, she said softly, then we go slow. We figure it out as we go instead of pretending we already have all the answers. Slow I can do. He pressed one more careful kiss to her forehead, echoing something familiar from a story neither of them had ever heard, though the gesture felt entirely his own regardless. "Your dad's gonna be home soon. I should probably go before he finds his daughter making questionable decisions in her kitchen at midnight." "Probably," Laura agreed, though she made no move to let go of his hand until he was already halfway out the door, rain still falling steady behind him into the dark. November brought Laura's grandmother to North Carolina for an unannounced visit, arriving on her father's doorstep with 2 suitcases and the particular energy of a woman who had opinions and intended to share every single one of them before she left. If tonight's story is bringing you a little comfort, consider subscribing so more stories like this can find their way to you when you need them. Constance Christie had never approved of her daughter's marriage to Marcus Bell, a disapproval she'd voiced clearly enough during Laura's childhood that even a young girl couldn't miss it. She arrived now with the same energy redirected fully onto Laura, settling into the guest room with the air of someone conducting an inspection rather than a visit. "You've lost weight," Constance observed within the first 10 minutes, studying Laura with the critical eye she'd once reserved for evaluating dinner party seating arrangements. "And this house," she glanced around the modest kitchen with poorly concealed distaste. "Well, I suppose it's not permanent." "It's home now, Grandma," Laura said carefully. "Dad's been good to me." "I'm sure he has." Constance's tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. "Though I have to say, baby, I worry about you out here, away from everything you're used to, everyone who actually understands your situation." Laura recognized the opening for what it was, a careful lead-in toward whatever real concern her grandmother had actually traveled 3 states to deliver. "What's really going on, Grandma?" Constance set down her tea, folding her hands with the deliberate composure of a woman preparing to say something unwelcome. "Your Aunt Denise mentioned you've been spending time with a young man, Deshawn's friend. Judd. His name is Judd. I'm sure he's perfectly nice," Constance said in a tone that suggested she'd already decided otherwise. "But Laura, baby, you have to think about your future, about what kind of life you're building for yourself. You come from something. Your mother's mistakes don't erase where you come from, and you shouldn't let one difficult year convince you to settle for less than you deserve." "Less than I deserve," Laura repeated slowly, "meaning someone who works with his hands, someone whose family didn't have money." "Meaning someone who understands the world you were raised in," Constance corrected, though the distinction felt thin. "I've seen this before, baby. Girls who go through hard times and end up settling for the first person who's kind to them, mistaking comfort for love. I don't want that for you. You're better than that." The word better landed with a weight Laura recognized immediately, the same coded language she'd absorbed her whole childhood without ever questioning its implications. Better meant a certain kind of education, a certain kind of last name, a certain kind of future that looked acceptable in the photographs her family displayed on mantels back home. Better, apparently, had never once meant a man who fixed things with his own 2 hands and told the truth even when it cost him something. "I love you, Grandma," I said carefully, "but I need you to understand something. I already lived a life built entirely around what other people decided was better for me. I'm not interested in building another one." Constance's mouth tightened, though whether from disagreement or something closer to recognition, Laura couldn't quite tell. Her grandmother didn't argue further that afternoon. She simply picked her tea back up, the conversation folding itself shut with the particular finality of 2 people who understood without needing to say it aloud that neither had actually convinced the other of anything.
Judd noticed the shift in her almost immediately after Constance's visit began, the particular guardedness that crept back into Laura's posture whenever her grandmother was within earshot. He said nothing about it directly for 3 days, waiting instead for Laura to bring it up on her own terms. She finally did, sitting on the tailgate of his truck outside the auto shop on a Sunday afternoon, watching him finish closing up for the day. "My grandmother thinks you're a phase, something I'll grow out of once I get my life back together." Judd didn't flinch, though something tightened briefly around his eyes. "That's so." She didn't say it exactly like that, but that's what she meant. Laura picked at a loose thread on her jeans, unable to quite meet his eyes. "She thinks I'm settling, mistaking comfort for love because I went through something hard." "And what do you think?" "I think she's wrong, but I also think I understand where it comes from. My whole family, going back generations, survived by making sure the next generation married up, not down. It's not really about you specifically. It's about a fear that's older than either of us." "Doesn't make it hurt less," Judd said quietly, being on the receiving end of somebody's inherited fear. "No," Laura agreed, "it doesn't. I'm sorry she made you feel like that, even indirectly." He was quiet a long moment, methodically wiping grease from his hands with a rag, avoiding her eyes now instead of the reverse. "Can I tell you something I haven't told you yet?" "Of course." "My mama left when I was 9, met a man with more money than my daddy ever had, decided that mattered more than staying. I grew up watching my daddy try to explain to a 9-year-old why the woman who was supposed to love him unconditionally decided a bigger house mattered more." He set the rag down, finally meeting her eyes. "So when your grandmother looks at me and decides I'm not good enough because of what I don't have, it doesn't just sting because of what she thinks about me. It scares me, Laura, because I've seen exactly how that kind of thinking plays out. I've watched it wreck somebody I loved." Laura felt something in her chest crack open at the admission, understanding suddenly the guardedness she'd occasionally caught beneath his easy confidence, the parts of himself he'd mentioned once before but never fully explained. "I need you to know something too," she said finally, breaking the quiet. "I've spent my whole life being what other people needed me to be. I'm done doing that. If I choose you, it won't be because I'm settling. It'll be because I actually looked and decided you were exactly who I wanted to find." Judd's hand tightened around hers, though he didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The confrontation Laura had been quietly dreading arrived on Thanksgiving, when Constance, still lingering in North Carolina longer than anyone had anticipated, found herself seated across the table from Judd for the first time. Marcus had invited him, along with his uncle and a scattering of neighbors, turning what might have been a small family dinner into a full house of mismatched folding chairs and borrowed dishes. Constance's disapproval simmered quietly through most of the meal, contained to pointed looks and clipped responses whenever Judd spoke. It boiled over finally over dessert when Deshawn mentioned, entirely without malice, that Judd had been saving toward opening his own shop eventually, once he finished his business degree. "That's ambitious," Constance said, in a tone that suggested the opposite. "Though I imagine that takes quite a while, working the hours you must be working just to afford night classes." "It does," Judd agreed evenly, refusing to take the bait she'd clearly set. "Good things usually do take a while, though. I'm not in a hurry." "No, I don't suppose you would be." Constance set down her fork with deliberate precision. "Some of us, though, don't have the luxury of not being in a hurry. Laura's mother built an entire career by the time she was 30. Some families understand urgency." "Grandma," Laura said, a warning edge creeping into her voice,
I'm simply making conversation, baby. Constance's smile didn't reach her eyes. Though I do wonder, Judd, what exactly you imagine you can offer my granddaughter, given everything she's used to. She comes from a certain kind of life. The table went quiet, the particular silence that falls when everyone recognizes a line has been crossed, but no one's yet decided how to address it. Marcus opened his mouth to intervene, but Judd spoke first, his voice steady, unhurried, carrying none of the defensiveness Constance clearly expected. With respect, ma'am, the kind of life Laura's used to already fell apart once from the inside, built on money that wasn't real to begin with. He held her gaze, not unkindly, but without backing down either. I can't offer her a big house or a black card that never runs dry. What I can offer is honest work and the truth, even when it's not comfortable to hear. Seems to me that's worth more than what she already lost once. Constance's mouth opened, then closed again, momentarily without a ready response. Laura reached for Judd's hand under the table, squeezing once, grateful and proud in equal measure. Your grandma's not wrong about everything. She's dead wrong about him, for what it's worth. Thank you, Laura said, meaning it more than the words could fully carry.
Constance left for Mississippi 3 days later, her farewell to Laura brief and formal, though something had softened almost imperceptibly in the set of her shoulders. "You'll do what you'll do," she said at the bus station, echoing without realizing it the same resignation Laura's mother had once offered from behind a different kind of glass. "I hope you're right about him, baby. I truly do." "I hope so too," Laura admitted. "But even if I'm wrong eventually, I'd rather have made my own mistake than lived somebody else's version of being right." Something like respect flickered across her grandmother's face, brief but unmistakable. "Your mother used to say things like that, before everything. I forgot she used to be brave like that too." The comment stayed with Laura long after the bus pulled away, a small, unexpected gift buried inside an otherwise difficult visit. December settled in with its own rhythm, finals looming, the auto shop slowing down for the holiday season, Judd finally admitting one evening over coffee at a diner near campus that he'd been putting off telling her something out of fear it might change things between them. "My daddy's thinking about selling the shop next year, business degree or not. If that happens, I don't know exactly what comes next for me. Might mean starting over somewhere else entirely." Laura studied him carefully, recognizing the vulnerability underneath the careful, measured delivery. "Are you telling me this because you're worried it changes something for us?" "Maybe," he admitted. "You've got a whole future mapped out here at Ashcroft. I don't want you feeling obligated to bend your plans around wherever mine end up landing." "Judd," she reached across the table for his hand, "I already rebuilt my entire life once, from nothing, in a state I'd never even visited before. I think I can handle uncertainty about where either of us ends up next. That's not the same as running from something. That's just what building an actual life together looks like." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple, but it's not complicated either. Not really. I choose you, wherever that ends up taking either of us." He studied her a long moment, something easing visibly in his shoulders, like he'd been braced for a different answer entirely. "I love you," he said, quiet but certain, the words arriving without ceremony, exactly the way she'd come to expect honesty from him, plain, unhurried, entirely without performance. "I love you too," Laura said,
and understood, saying it, that she meant it more completely than she'd ever meant anything in her old, carefully curated life. They sat there a while longer, coffee going cold between them, neither in any hurry to leave the small, ordinary diner booth where something quietly permanent had just settled into place. Outside, the first real cold of December pressed against the window glass, but inside, for the first time in months, Laura felt no urge at all to be anywhere else.
Winter break arrived quietly. Laura's first full semester at Ashcroft finally behind her. Grades landing better than she dared hope, given everything that had unraveled just months earlier. She spent the break settling more fully into her father's house, no longer feeling like a guest borrowing space, but something closer to a permanent resident. Deshawn's guarded distance having softened over the months into something resembling genuine affection. If this story has brought you any comfort tonight, take a moment to like the video. It helps more people find these quiet stories when they need 'em most. She called her mother every week now, the conversations gradually shifting from careful logistics toward something more honest. Vivian's voice during their most recent call carried a steadiness Laura hadn't heard in months. "I've been thinking a lot in here," her mother said, "about the kind of mother I was, the kind of lessons I taught you without meaning to, about what mattered and what didn't. You don't have to do this right now," Laura said gently. "I want to." A pause. "I taught you that love and money were supposed to go together, baby, that you couldn't have one without the other, not really. I'm sorry for that. I watch you talk about this young man, Judd, and I hear something in your voice I never once heard when you talked about that Ashworth boy. I hear somebody who's actually happy, not just comfortable." Laura felt tears gathering, unexpected and warm. "Thank you for saying that." "I mean it," Vivian said. "Whatever else I got wrong, I hope I can still get this part right, supporting you in choosing something real, even if it doesn't look like what I once imagined for you." The call ended shortly after, monitored time running out the way it always did, but Laura carried the conversation with her for days afterward, a small, unexpected repair in a relationship she'd assumed might stay permanently fractured. Judd noticed the shift in her almost immediately. "Good call with your mom?" he asked, finding her curled up on her father's porch swing that evening, phone still warm in her hand. "Better than I expected," Laura admitted. "She said something today that actually surprised me, something almost like an apology that didn't come with an excuse attached." "That's growth," Judd said, settling beside her on the swing. "Even from behind bars, apparently." "Apparently." Laura leaned into his shoulder, watching the last of the winter light fade over Willow Bend's quiet street. "I keep thinking about how different this year looks than anything I imagined a year ago, losing everything I thought mattered, only to find things I didn't even know I was missing." "Regret any of it?" he asked. "If you could go back and keep the old life instead." She considered the question seriously, the way she'd learned to from him. "No," she said finally, with complete certainty. They sat together on the porch swing until the street lights flickered on, neither in any hurry to go back inside, the quiet between them comfortable in a way silence had rarely felt before this year. Spring semester brought new rhythms, Laura declaring a major in social work, drawn, she realized, toward exactly the kind of clear-eyed honesty Judd had modeled for her since the day they met.
She wanted to help families navigate exactly the kind of collapse hers had gone through, the sudden unraveling that left people scrambling for solid ground with no map to guide them. Judd's father did, in the end, sell the auto shop that March, the sale finalizing faster than anyone anticipated. But rather than the uncertain scattering Judd had once feared, the transition opened an unexpected door. The new owner, impressed by Judd's steady competence and half-finished business degree, offered him a management position overseeing 3 locations across the county, a role that came with better pay and, more importantly, room to eventually build something of his own. "Feels strange," Judd admitted, the night he told her about the offer, both of them sitting on the same porch swing that had become their unofficial place for difficult conversations. "Something I was scared would fall apart turned into something better than what I had before." "Maybe that's just how it goes sometimes," Laura said, echoing, without quite realizing it, a lesson she'd learned from her own unraveling. The thing you're most afraid of losing clears space for something you didn't know you needed yet. He studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded in his expression. "You've changed a lot, since that first cookout, when you didn't even know what oxtail was." "I've learned a few things," she said, smiling, "mostly from a very stubborn man who refused to let me hide behind who I used to be." "Somebody had to." He reached for her hand, holding it with the same steady certainty he brought to everything meaningful in his life. "I'm proud of you, Laura, not because of anything you had to prove to anybody, just because I've watched you build something real out of what could have broken you completely." The comment settled warmly in her chest, and she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely at peace with exactly where she'd landed. Not the life she'd once imagined for herself, but one that fit her better than that old life ever actually had. "Come to Mississippi with me this summer," she said suddenly, the idea arriving fully formed. "I want you to meet my mother properly once she's out, and I want to show you where I came from, the parts of it that actually mattered, before you decide the whole state is just Ashworths and country clubs. I'd like that, long as you promise to teach me which fork to use so your grandmother doesn't have another reason to look at me sideways." Laura laughed, the sound easy and unguarded. "Grandma likes you more than she'll ever admit. She just needs time to catch up to what I already know." "And what's that?" "That you're exactly the kind of better I actually needed, not the kind anybody warned me about." Vivian Christie's release came in early May, 6 months earlier than her original sentence, thanks to good behavior and a program credit she'd earned tutoring fellow inmates in financial literacy, an irony not lost on either of them, given everything that had led her there in the first place. Laura and Judd drove down together for the occasion, the 12-hour trip filled with easy conversation and the particular comfort of 2 people who'd learned over the better part of a year exactly how to occupy shared silence without it feeling heavy. Vivian looked different when they finally saw her, thinner, grayer at the temples, but carrying herself with a steadiness Laura hadn't seen in years, something like genuine humility replacing the polished confidence that used to define her. She embraced Laura first, holding on longer than either of them expected, before turning to study Judd with open, unguarded curiosity. "So you're the one," she said, extending her hand. "Vivian, I understand I owe you some gratitude for whatever part you played in helping my daughter become the young woman standing in front of me right now." "Ma'am, she did that mostly on her own," Judd said, shaking her hand. "I just refused to let her hide from it." Vivian studied him a moment longer, something like approval settling into her expression. "I like him," she said to Laura, plainly, without ceremony. "I hope you know how rare that is, me saying that about anybody." "I know," Laura said, smiling. They spent that first evening at a small restaurant outside Jackson, nothing like the polished establishments Vivian used to favor, and Laura watched her mother navigate the unfamiliar humility of ordering from a menu without prices attached to any particular meaning, adjusting slowly to a life rebuilt from something closer to the ground up. "I have to start over completely," Vivian admitted over dinner. "No firm will hire me again, not with my record. I'm thinking about consulting, maybe, teaching, possibly, warning other people away from the mistakes I made." "That sounds like exactly the kind of thing that might actually help someone, better than the life you had before, in a way that matters more." Her mother reached across the table, covering Laura's hand with her own. "You sound like him," she said, nodding toward Judd. "That clear-eyed way of seeing things without dressing it up in anything unnecessary. I think that's good for you, baby. I think that's exactly what you needed, even if I didn't know enough to want it for you sooner." "You know now," Laura said gently. "That's what matters." Vivian's eyes went bright, though she blinked the emotion back before it could fully surface. "Yes," she agreed, "I suppose it is." Later that night, walking back to the small motel they'd booked for the visit, Judd slipped his hand into hers without either of them needing to say anything about it. Some things Laura had learned simply didn't require narration anymore. They just were, quiet and certain, the way the truest things usually turned out to be. They drove back to North Carolina 3 days later, the Mississippi humidity giving way slowly to the cooler air of the Carolina foothills. Laura watching the landscape shift the same way it had nearly a year earlier, except this time heading towards something instead of running from it. Thank you for staying with Laura and Judd through every turn of their story tonight. Summer settled easily over Willow Bend, Judd's promotion allowing him to finally start putting money aside for the shop he still hoped someday to open under his own name. Laura spent the break volunteering at a local family services nonprofit, gaining the kind of hands-on experience that made her declared major feel less like an abstract choice and more like a calling she genuinely found. One evening in late June, sitting together on the same porch swing that had witnessed nearly every important conversation of the past year, Judd turned to her with an unusual seriousness in his expression. "I've been thinking," he said, "about everything, about where we started and where we've ended up." "Good thoughts, I hope?" Laura echoed, an old habit of lightness that no longer felt necessary to hide behind, though it still came naturally when she was happy. "The best kind." He took her hand, turning it over gently in his own, tracing an absent pattern across her palm. "A year ago, I watched you show up to a cookout not knowing what oxtail was, looking like you'd rather be anywhere else on earth. And now here you are, about to spend your whole career helping people rebuild the exact kind of life you had to rebuild yourself. Life has a funny way of turning wreckage into purpose, if you let it." "I don't have a ring yet," Judd said, catching her off guard with this sudden shift. "I'm not asking anything tonight, not really. I just need you to know, plainly, without dressing it up, I see a whole future with you in it. Not the future your family once mapped out, and not the future I imagined for myself either growing up. Something better than either version, because we're building it together, on purpose, instead of just falling into whatever was already laid out for us. Laura felt her eyes go warm, though she managed a soft, unguarded laugh through the emotion. That might be the most honest proposal-adjacent thing anyone's ever said to me. "I've had good practice," he said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Learned it from watching you finally stop performing for people who never deserved the show." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, listening to the steady, familiar rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the warm hum of a Carolina summer evening. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and fell quiet. The same small, ordinary sound that had marked her very first night in this unfamiliar town, back when she had no idea it would eventually become the place she chose deliberately to call home. It wasn't the life she'd once imagined for herself, wrapped in designer labels and inherited comfort. It was steadier than that, and infinitely more honest. Two people who'd each survived their own particular unraveling, choosing each other deliberately, without pretense, one ordinary porch swing evening at a time. Thank you for spending these quiet hours with Laura and Judd. I hope their story brought you a little peace tonight. Sleep well, and we'll meet again soon. Good night.